Hello, in this video I'm going to be estimating the population of Atlantis. I'm doing a sort of a census for Atlantis. So first of all, we know that Atlantis was divided into 10 different kingdoms. That's what Plato tells us. And we know that there's a royal kingdom of Atlas's lineage, who was the eldest of the sons of Poseidon in the story. And he also happened to have nine siblings, nine brothers, whose descendants each had their own kingdoms. And so the idea is that Plato tells us details about the lineage of Atlas and his kingdom, but he doesn't really go into that much detail about the other nine kingdoms. But we can kind of calculate the population of the royal kingdom and then just multiply that by a certain factor to account for the other nine kingdoms of Atlantis. And so um, Plato doesn't directly tell us the population of Atlantis or even provide an estimate, but what he does do is he tells us exactly how large the size of the military forces of Atlantis are. And he goes into an incredible amount of detail in describing this. And based on that size of the military and knowing the typical military civilian ratios of large world powers that exist today, we can kind of get an estimate as to the overall population of Atlantis. And so it is said that in the dialogues of Plato that Atlantis has 800,000 foot soldiers and a certain amount of horses and chariots, and also 1,200 ships, which are described as triremes in the dialogue. And this information can be obtained in the dialogue just by reading it, but it's hard to really get at exactly what he's trying to talk about. So I just looked it up on a website called atlantipedia.ie, which is maintained by an Atlantis researcher named Tony O'Connell, who has created this enormous encyclopedia that has basically everything on Atlantis that you could ever imagine. And one of the articles on that online encyclopedia is the army of Atlantis. And so if we do a further estimation here, we can see that the typical trireme in the time of Greece at least had around 170 sailors per ship. So multiplying these two numbers, we get 200,000 sailors around. And so we get a total military force of around 1 million. We know that the average military civilian ratios of the permanent members of the UN Security Council, which can be considered in short the world's world powers, is around 8.5 per 1,000, as you can see here. They vary significantly, with Russia having the most and China having the least, but that's the average estimate here. And we know that it's safe to only consider these numbers, these countries, because we know that Atlantis, if it existed, was one of the, if not the chief world power of its time. And so it wouldn't make sense to consider countries that are just like inconsequential on the world stage in an estimate to determine the population of a world power that existed uh, over 10,000 years ago. And so using that average ratio, given the size of Atlantis's military forces and multiplying it by the typical ratio of a world power today, we get that the kingdom of Atlantis, the primary royal kingdom, had a population of around 120 million. But of course, there's the other nine princedoms that we have to include, and we can kind of assume that the main kingdom had around half of Atlantis's total population. So we multiply that by two in order to get a population of 240 million for the entire kingdom of Atlantis. Now, this doesn't mean that Atlantis didn't also have colonies with an additional population. But just focusing on the main kingdom of Atlantis and disregarding whatever empire that it may have had throughout the world, that's still four times the population of the Roman Empire at its peak. It's still five times the population of the Persian Empire in 480 BC when it attacked Greece at that time. And it's actually 75% of the population of the United States right now as we speak. And so if this is just this is a massive amount of people, and it's a huge population. And that's one of the reasons why accepting Atlantis as a theory, as a legitimate theory for consideration, is just is so far out of the question for most scholars. It's because it really is a paradigm shift if we were to accept it. And the world population at the time of Atlantis was said to have been destroyed is only 90. It was only around 5 million people, and so 240 divided by 5 is, I'm not sure, but I think it's like 48. So Atlantis, the population of Atlantis is almost 50 times larger than the population of the entire world at the time, and that's just not. This is like an almost two order of magnitude difference. It's not something that you can really fit into an existing theory or existing picture of the world. And so even if Atlantis was destroyed only 900 years ago instead of 9,000, as some Atlantis researchers like to say, or mostly as Atlantis skeptics, the estimated world population even then was only around 50 to 100 million, which is like maybe four. It's like a fourth of the population of Atlantis. So Atlantis is a paradigm shift, regardless of what we're of what the estimated population exactly is at the time. And if Atlantis is real, it means everything, not just everything about the history of human civilization is wrong. It means that like our whole understanding of the demographics of the past is wrong too. And it's not just wrong by a few percent. It's not just wrong by around even 50 to 100%. It's wrong by like 50, a factor of 50 times. It means that we have just completely forgotten one of the, if not the most important civilizations that has ever existed. And that's really hard to accept for most people.